You're listening to Pondering Pennies with Dempsy and Ray.
All right, welcome back to the latest episode of Pondering Pennies. Ray is MIA again, out of the country, so we only got the fan favorite here, Dempsey, joined by Uther. Uther just finished up his law university over at Oxford. He's starting a master's program in law over at Edinburgh. Up until last year, he was an active participant in the UK's Labour Party. Uther, you want to introduce yourself to the people?
Yeah, hi. So my name's Uther Naysmith. As mentioned, I studied law at Oxford. I'm currently doing a master's in Oxford. And I've been involved in sort of left-wing politics in the UK now since I was 14 years old, really. I joined the Labour Party originally to support Jeremy Corbyn, who is he's the British Bernie Sanders, really, very firebrand left-wing figure. And I was involved in that until last year. We lost, actually, the last election in 2019 very, very badly to the Conservative Party. And there was a changeover in leadership. It's now led by a man called Keir Starmer, who's much more sort of right-wing. You can consider him, I don't know, the equivalent to, say, the Clintons. And I've not agreed really with the direction they've taken with it. So I've been sort of a floating voter for the last year now. On top of that, I've written for a couple of publications. I've written for the Fabian Society, which is the world's oldest socialist think tank, founded in Britain in the 1880s. I've written articles for the Labour Party online and stuff like that. And I've also written for the Haldane Society for Socialist Lawyers. And really, I'm just here sort of to explain a point of view, to explain the socialist point of view, the way we look at capitalism, what we think the problems are, and why we think socialism is the only answer. That, I think, is all I can say by way of an introduction.
Yeah, no, that was good. Definitely thorough. Thank you for taking the time to do that. Before we jump too deep into it, actually, I had a quick question when you said the Labour Party's kind of shifted more to the right. I'm assuming still left of center, but more to the right since the loss in 2022. Do British politics kind of, I feel like, follow the flavor that the US has since the 90s, where one party will win for one or two cycles in a row, and then it just kind of swings to the other party, and you just kind of get like this batting of back and forth? So the Labour Party kind of saw like maybe a little bit of a pushback since, they said they didn't favor so well against the Conservative Party, so they want to maintain left-leaning ideas, but maybe seem a little more appealing to people in the center to kind of grab that vote, or what was going on there?
Yeah, great question. There's actually some interesting comparisons between British politics and American politics, but I'll take the first part of your question first. So in 2019, that was when we last had a general election. And the Labour Party has suffered its worst ever loss since the 1930s, since the Great Depression, which was very heartbreaking to all of us who supported for it. I campaigned in Mansfield, which is sort of a smallish town in the middle of the country, very post-industrial. They used to have coal mines there in the 1980s. Now they don't. Same story as the Rust Belt in America. And there was this real hostility to the Labour Party from the people living there. And these kinds of places had voted Labour for a very, very long time, very working class Labour voters. And I had people, slamming the door in my face and swearing at me. And the mood was very hostile. And they felt, I think, that the Labour Party, they sort of sympathised with a lot of the ideas about social justice and the redistribution of wealth, but there was this real lack of trust in the political classes in general, but especially in the Labour Party. And I think exactly like in America over the past sort of 30 years or so, there's been a real ebbing away of trust in politicians in general. I think people are very anti-politics. All parties are the same. None of them really care about our interests, our communities. And just like in America, they've watched the government change hands between the left and the right. Labour and the Conservatives in Britain, Republicans and Democrats in America. Meanwhile, the real issues, you know, poverty, inequality, crumbling infrastructure, these issues that are affecting our communities just are not getting solved by any party in power. And so the Labour Party now, of course, new leader, they are trying to sort of shift to the right to attract back some of their former voters. But I personally think they've adopted the wrong track, because a lot of the anger in these communities is anger at exactly the kinds of the political elites that dominated centre left parties back 20 years ago. You know, a lot of people, Tony Blair, we had in Britain, followed by Gordon Brown. In America, it's the Clintons, it's Obama, it's Biden, it's all of these very out of touch elitist politicians who lead very, very different lives from ordinary people and just don't get the issues that affect people or how to solve them. And what the Labour Party's done is, over the past couple of years since the last election, they have abandoned all of their most popular policies. So the things that people liked about Jeremy Corbyn, and they did opinion polling on it, was they liked the fact that he wanted to nationalize public services, so bring them into state control, like the railways, water, energy, public services. They liked the fact that he wanted to redistribute wealth. They liked, you know, protecting the National Health Service, which is Britain's state-funded health service. It's incredibly popular in this country. Even abolishing tuition fees was quite popular amongst a lot of people, and they've gone back on their word on that in just the last couple of days, actually. And the Labour Party is sort of, their strategy at the moment is to try and adopt all of the conservative ideology and politics and economics, which they think will get them back into government. And the argument they have is, well, you know, you can't do anything without political power, so we need to win first. But I think they're going in completely the wrong direction, because they're abandoning the very things that made people want to vote for them in the first place, and they're bringing back this very elitist and out of touch political class that has really dominated left-wing politics over the past couple of decades. And you see it all around the world. In the Socialist Party in France have been completely destroyed because they were led by men like Francois Hollande, who had exactly the same sort of ideas. It's called, here we call it, I think, triangulating towards the third way, this kind of very centrist kind of politics. It's the New Democrats in America since the 90s. Syriza in Greece sort of went back on their word and did a similar thing. You know, you look all around the world, and centre-left parties that got millions and millions of votes 50, 60 years ago because of organised labour and the trade unions and the working class movement are now completely on the decline because they've become dominated by out of touch, middle class, really, professionals that do not speak for the communities they're claiming to represent in elections. And I don't think what Keir Starmer is doing, or what the Democrats are doing in America, I don't think that's the way to fix it.
Do you, and I know you mentioned, you know, they lost the election, so they're kind of coming more towards the center to try and capture some of that vote back, because they can't implement the ideas and the policies that they want if they can't get in office.
Yeah.
But what would you say to, I don't know how bad, you know, the election results were, how bad they lost, but if it was like a full on rebuke of the ideology, then is it almost kind of contradictive not to move more towards the center because people must not like that agenda if they didn't vote for it? Or do you think it just goes back to some kind of misinformation campaign, or just the overall distrust in government that you mentioned before? Why do you think the people would abandon that side of the aisle, and then the party would continue to hold those beliefs, thinking, well, maybe next time around they'll vote for him?
Yeah, good question. But I think really it depends on, you have to look at why people didn't vote a certain way. I mean, the political context a couple of years ago in Britain was sort of dominated by a couple of really, really difficult issues. Brexit, are you familiar with Brexit?
Yes, yes. I believe it was like around 2016, and I was sitting in the kitchen at work in Alaska at the time I was living when I saw the referendum had passed to leave the EU.
Right, yeah. And the 2019 election was really, really the Brexit election. Because what happened was, yes, as you say, we voted to leave in 2016, but there was this very long and complicated process of negotiations. And what eventually ended up happening by 2019 was the Tory party, that's the Conservative Party, were led by Boris Johnson. And they said, if we win the election, we've got a deal ready to go. We'll just leave the European Union straight away. Whereas the Labour Party, they kind of were trying to appeal to sort of liberal voters in cities and in sort of, leafy suburban type areas. And they said, well, if we win the election, we'll hold a second EU referendum to make sure, they said, to make sure that it is what people actually wanted, because there was a lot of churn of political opinions during this process of negotiation. They said, let's resolve the deadlock by going back to the country and holding a second referendum. And this was an incredibly unpopular policy to the traditional Labour voters in places like Mansfield, who had overwhelmingly voted to leave the European Union. And they saw it very, very strongly as a betrayal by the leaders that were meant to represent them in the Labour Party. And I think that's one of the big reasons why Labour lost so badly. And it was a complete defeat. I think Parliament has 650 seats. You need 325-ish to form a majority. Labour got 200. Really, really bad defeat. Conservatives got their largest majority since the 1980s under Thatcher. And a lot of it was because of this Brexit issue, because you had people voting Conservative for the first time in their lives, because to them, the Labour Party was not supporting the democratic will of the majority of the people. And I think that was a big reason. Other issues were they didn't trust the Labour Party on national defence. A lot of people thought that the leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, was unpatriotic. I think a lot of those criticisms were quite unfair, but that's how a lot of people felt at the time. What you didn't see was people really criticising the Labour Party's economic policies. So, some people thought, well, they want to spend too much money, it's economically unsustainable, and the newspapers in Britain, which are very right wing, and also the TV broadcasters, they did spread a lot of disinformation about it. I'm not saying you can blame that for the defeat, but there was a lot of, shall we say, creative campaigning. But generally, when members of the public were asked on the issues, what's your opinion, they tended to side with the more left-wing economic policies. People do think there's a role for the government in the economy. People do want capitalism to be properly regulated. They want workers' rights to be protected. They want a clean, safe environment. They want more houses. I mean, in Britain, there's a very bad housing crisis at the moment. Rents, rip-off rents, landlords, treating their tenants with impunity, and millions of people on the waiting list to access social housing. And so on all of these bread and butter issues of economic policy, most people are quite sympathetic to the very, very radical left-wing point of view. It's just these other issues that sort of intervene and make people distrustful. And that's my criticism of Keir Starmer, really, is he's gotten rid of all the popular parts, but kept all the unpopular parts of the Labour Party's platform. And maybe he will win the next election. He's currently polling ahead of the Conservatives, but that's not really difficult to do given how bad the economic crisis is in Britain at the moment. People are really feeling the pinch from inflation, from poor government decisions about how to handle the economy. There's a high likelihood that Labour might form the next government with this sort of more centrist manifesto from Keir Starmer. But if he gets elected, he will not be able to solve the problems that our communities are facing because he just hasn't come up with the ideas. He's too obsessed with trying to appeal to the center. And the problem with doing that is when you appeal to the center, it sort of blocks your ability to come up with creative, out of the box solutions that in many cases are absolutely necessary. Like with the former manifesto under Corbyn, they wanted to redistribute wealth, tax the rich, and invest it in actual public spending, in infrastructure, in, investment in businesses, in the economy, to create good jobs for people and to bring some life back to many of these left behind communities. I don't think Keir Starmer is going to do any of that. And so, 5 or 10 years down the line, we'll just be in the same position we're in now.
Do you think this could possibly set up a trend where you have the Conservatives staying to the right, you have the Labour Party moving to the right but not crossing the center line? Say they do win the next election cycle, but they're not able to fulfill the promises they make the corrections that they say they're going to make. And then the next cycle, so 2 cycles from now, Conservatives take it back due to just a general, disdain for the last coalition government. And then you see the Labour Party then again move more to the right. And it's kind of like this self-fulfilling thing. And you kind of see just a shift to the right in general.
Yeah, I do think there's quite a high likelihood of that happening. And really, I think it's the same story all across the Western world since the 1980s. I mean, you go back to the 60s, 70s, and you had real socialist or, social democratic politics in Sweden, France, Britain, Germany, all across the Western world, even in America. I mean, America, you've never really had a socialist movement, but certainly you had the coalition of New Deal liberals back in the 60s, 70s. And the sort of left-wing political ideology has been on the retreat now for a generation or more since Reaganomics, since Thatcherism. I don't think there have been any significant successful left-wing political movements in the past 40 years. Where you have had left-wing parties elected, it's been under very right-wing manifestos with right-wing ideas. And if parties like the Labour Party are suffering terminal decline, which over the trend history suggests they might, losing members, losing trust, losing elections, I think it's exactly the effect that you described, that conservative right-wing parties have shifted politics to the right, and left-wing parties all across the world have been sort of chasing their tails, trying to catch up with them, and not putting up any resistance against it.
Some of the things you mentioned earlier too, that the Labour Party previously had been campaigning on: tuition, redistribution of wealth, nationalizing certain services across the countries. If we could dive into that and what that looks like. So as a obviously well-educated man, you've probably spent the better part of a decade in higher learning with your different degrees. What does eliminating tuition look like on a national level?
Right, interesting. Well, the system for tuition fees is a bit different in the UK to how it works in America. I think I'm not really well versed in the US system. But in Britain, if you want to study an undergraduate degree, you get given a loan by the government that covers the fees, that is capped at, I think, £9,000 a year, roughly. And you also get another loan on top of that to cover living expenses. You can also get often bursaries from universities. Some are more generous than other universities. Oxford is quite generous because they're a very rich university. But yeah, it is a state system of regulated loans. And I've heard some horror stories about people in the US being charged very, very high prices to study. It's not quite as bad here because it is regulated. It's a public government service, essentially. And the deal for repaying them isn't bad either. it gets taken off your salary, sort of like a graduate tax. If you earn over a certain amount per year, I think it starts at 20 something thousand pounds a year, you start paying it as a very, very small percentage of your salary over a number of years. What the Labour Party said was, really, this system shouldn't exist at all, because if you look at higher education in the UK over the past decade, I mean, tuition fees were brought in the early 2000s. And if you look since then, what you have seen is a real commodification of education. Whereas before that, the system wasn't perfect, but there was a sense that education is a public good, that it benefits everybody in society to have well-trained doctors, well-trained architects, engineers, lawyers, and so on and so forth. And also that learning just isn't something that people should have to pay for, that universities should not be a market, because it should be about academic freedom and the understanding and wisdom. We all who study, all of us are meant to at least contribute to the sum of human knowledge, benefiting not just ourselves, but the wider community. Now, since the tuition fees were brought in, universities have essentially adopted policies to try and attract more students because they get paid per student. And I think in many cases it's led to the decline in the standards and contract terms of professors and university support staff, who, by the way, have been on strike all across the country over the past couple of months to a year to try and protect their terms and conditions. It's led to declining standards of teaching, because essentially universities are trying to cram as many students in as they can to get the money, which has, of course, led to worsening outcomes for individuals. And all of this is going on whilst we have a real skills shortage in this country. To take an example, the NHS has, I don't remember the exact figures, but tens of thousands of vacancies, I believe, because they cannot get the people. And all the while, we have this very commodified and inefficient education system. The Labour Party said in their last manifesto, essentially the argument was that by having this tuition fee system, you're taxing the aspiration of individuals, people, good, ordinary, decent people who want to succeed in life and, pay their way through life, do something good for society. And you're essentially putting barriers up to stop them from doing that. And it's not right. They said you should get a grant from the government for your living expenses, paid for through taxation, and just cut tuition fees out of the picture. That's essentially what the proposal was, and that's the reasoning behind it. I don't know if what Bernie Sanders has been proposing in the US is similar, but I imagine it's not too different.
So the US has community colleges, it has private schools, it's got all kinds of different things broken up in the states, right? So you could attend a school in your state and it might be cheaper than one outside your state, because a lot of schools have in-state and out-of-state tuition rates. The out-of-state tuition rates are always higher than the resident rate. But there's a lot of options for $4,000 a year for going to a community college to complete an associate's degree. And once you get past that for a bachelor's, master's, PhD, there's schools that cost $60,000 a year, and there's schools that continue to cost that low $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 a year. So really, a lot of it's almost kind of like I'm not sure what the right word for it is. It's almost kind of like fashion for schools, almost in the US, where the curriculum is governed the same, and the credits are all interchangeable amongst most of the higher education schools when you're going for a bachelor's or a master's. But for some reason, people just they choose the $60,000 a year school because I went to Harvard, or versus Texas State, university that only cost $8,000 a year. And it's almost, like, look at the, I drive a Bugatti instead of a Forward Focus kind of thing. To me is what it seems like it's really turned into. At the end of the day, you got the paper, you got the credentials.
Interesting. I have to ask, I do you have a student loan system? Do most people have to take out loans to go to university in the States?
You can take out student loans. So there's a multitude of things. You can get grants from the government. Grants don't have to be paid back. A lot of things are based off of filling out forms for your economic standing. So where you are social economically. So if your parents make $250,000 a year, realistically, you're probably not going to get any tuition assistance. The school is going to be like, yeah, your parents can afford for you to go. If you live with your single mom, dad's not in the picture, she makes $30,000 a year, that's going to open up more doors to you for tuition assistance. And then at the end of the day, you can get loans from the government besides grants that you do have to pay back. Those can be deferred for quite a period of time before you have to make minimum payments on those. You can get private personal loans as well from different banks and credit unions and stuff. And then a lot of times schools will even cut down on the cost of tuition based on how much money, the household that you live in makes. And then there's always things like scholarships and grants that you can apply for as well. I feel like the big two in the US is you either get an academic scholarship based on your grades, or you get a sports scholarship where you're going to a school, to play football, hockey, track, something like that. And they want you as an athlete because obviously the colleges make a lot of money off those programs. And if it costs them $80,000 for your 4 years of being there, their football team's going to make way more money than that. So it benefits them to attract those athletes by having a desirable school that athlete can then attend for free.
Interesting. Now, here's my question is, don't you think, as socialists, we ask the question, don't you think that by having a fee system, you sort of lose something in the process of education, that it becomes just another commodity to be bought and sold? I think that's really our objection to it, is the university system in Britain, what it's become. Yes, more people now than ever before are going to university, but all it is a slip of paper saying, give me a job. And, even then, a lot of people who have degrees don't go on to work very good jobs. And I think with the fee system, you kind of lose something about the purpose of education, which is academic freedom, intellectual enlightenment, and having a group of people who can contribute through knowledge to the wider public good. When you marketize or commodify education, I think you lose sight of what the system is meant to be all about, really.
To me personally, when for a few $1,000s you can get a degree, and people make the personal decision to put themselves in the hole, tens of thousands, if not $100,000 in debt, because they have their dream school that they want to attend, and they do it in a job that they know they are then going to go into the outside world and make $30,000 a year. That was just poor decision making on their part. Now, maybe that's a system that's predatory, and those are big decisions for an 18-year-old to make without the proper guidance. But there's definitely smarter ways to go about it, I believe.
Perhaps, and I can't really comment on the American system. Here it's a flat rate, whatever university you go to. So Oxford and Cambridge are considered amongst the best. If you go there, you pay the same $9,000 as you would for any other university. There is sort of a leveling out, and also in Britain, admissions are purely on the basis of merit. Of course, there's biases in that, but the idea is it's purely on the basis of merit. But nobody who goes into the education system asks to be working a minimum wage job at the end of it, or a low paid job at the end of it. The whole idea on which capitalist society is based is this ideology of social mobility. The idea that you as an individual should be able to work hard or study hard and earn your place in society. And, for many, many years, there's been some attempt at making this a reality, especially after the Second World War. But what you see today is this real disconnect between the capitalist ideology, which says people who work hard get rewarded, and the reality, which is you can have people now, let's take students as an example, because we're talking about tuition fees, but you have a whole generation of people who have been told by their schools, by their parents, by politicians, people say to them, study hard, and at the end of it, you will be rewarded with a good life. And then you pay the tuition fees, you saddle yourself with this debt, and at the end of it, you're left with not very much at all. That's not an individual failure. That is a failure on the part of society to provide good jobs, a good standard of living for its people. I think, yes, people make mistakes, but you can't blame it on the individual when the individual has been essentially doing what society expects of them.
Yeah, I understand that point of view. I noted that you mentioned kind of seems like there's a wee bit of a decline in Britain right now on the level of learning that's being achieved at the secondary schools. And do you think that's possibly due to a lack of incentivizing performance on the end of the school and the professors? Because at the end of the day, the only thing that's going to attract more money to the school is just people in general, versus in a free market where they're able to charge what they want. Obviously, if I open up the school of Pondering Pennies ran by Dempsy, I charge $100,000 a year for my master's program. Probably no one's going to show up because I'm not a professor.
Interesting. I don't think the free market would be a solution to the problem we've got in Britain. I think the problem is having too much of a market already. I wouldn't blame the professors. I wouldn't even necessarily blame the universities. I think they're just trying to fit in with the framework that's been provided for them. But I think the problem is that, or part of the problem is that there's been a real decline in the value of having a degree. In the 1950s, only a very, very small proportion of people went to university and had a degree, who went on to become, say, lawyers and doctors and so on. Nowadays, we've got much more of an emphasis placed on social mobility through education. So the idea pushed by politicians in Britain is social mobility. They love the word social mobility. It's essentially, if you're poor, you can study your way out of it. I grew up in a poor household. I was taught to value having a good education. On the whole, I can't say it's been unsuccessful for me. I've been fairly lucky. But I think the problem is when you have politicians pushing people into the university system in huge numbers without any thought being put into what kind of life these people are going to go on to, all you end up with is people with master's degrees, flipping burgers and standing on factory assembly lines.
So do you think there's an oversaturation in the market then? Not everyone has to go to college. It's okay to call it good after high school, or because especially if it becomes free, then why wouldn't you attend? And then wouldn't that further devalue that diploma at the end of the day?
Interesting. A good question. I think really, give me 1 second to think about that.
Okay.
Yeah, you've got a point, but the thing is, yes, there's been an oversaturation, or well, you can call it an oversaturation with the amount of people studying. But the solution isn't to put barriers in the way of an education. I think a civilized society is one that values, the quest for knowledge. I think everyone should have access to that. It's about the kinds of lives we're creating for people under capitalism. I think absolutely people should not have to go to university to succeed. You should be able to leave school at 18 and go on to have a decent life. And in the 1960s, 1970s, largely you could do that. You know, people would leave school at 16 and go and work in the local factory. And that's fine. You know, plenty of people are happy with that. It's a decent life. But the problem today is that these jobs don't exist for people. People are being pushed into the university system specifically as a way to make them more employable, to compete for white collar jobs that are becoming more and more competitive because you have more and more graduates. And the old fashioned way to live a good life was working in, you know, a blue collar job. You would work in a factory, you would work in, you know, steel, coal mining. A lot of them were very dirty jobs. Can't say a lot of people miss them, but there's a real lack of jobs you can go to fresh out of school that will give you a decent life. Nowadays, you can't support a family on one person's income. There's this real pressure to succeed, to accumulate more money, you know, go for the higher paying jobs. What happened to those good, decent factory jobs? You know, you look at it since the 70s, 80s, a lot of those jobs are abroad now. And I'm not a nationalist. I don't want to say that Britain and America should be the only countries in the world with good jobs. But what you see since the 70s and 80s is the complete destruction of the industrial blue collar workforce. We've become importing service economies instead of exporting industrial economies. You know, look at the Rust Belt in America. Look at what happened to US Steel. Look at what happened to the auto manufacturing in Detroit. In Britain, we have coal mines have all shut down, more or less. The steel works have shut down. You know, in the 1970s, the steel industry in Britain employed more than 250,000 workers, and now it employs only 30,000. And you can say, oh, well, you know, maybe not everyone should go to university, but okay, what else are they going to do? If you don't go and get a degree and compete for these white collar jobs, you are essentially stuck working in a warehouse or a call center on minimum wage, and that's not a decent life for people. That's not a dignified life for people. That's the whole problem with this capitalist idea of social mobility that's being forced on people these days. Is they tell you that if you're poor, you should go and study and work hard to succeed, but you know, that's not addressing the root cause of the issues, which lies in the fact that working class communities have been economically devastated over the last 30 years. You can take a handful of people out of the ghetto and put them in a university and give them a good white collar job, but when are politicians actually going to solve the problems that are affecting these communities in the first place? You should not have to go and leave home and go to university to have a good life. But let's not forget that the fact that our working class communities, our blue collar communities, have been so decimated over the past 30 years is the consequence of political decisions about what kind of economy we want to have, is this very globalist capitalist economy. You know, give people choices. If you don't want people to be forced into university, you've got to give people alternatives.
Do you think that could be best achieved by kind of pulling back from globalization, or at least maybe leveling the playing field with different tariffs and stuff? Because at the end of the day, no matter what policies you put at home, if in places like India, China, and other, you know, lower waged workers can be paid literally pennies on the dollars to manufacture something, those jobs will just never exist in a Western economy that's kind of shifted to technology and service industries.
Mm. In the early 1980s, we had a really bad recession here right at the start of Margaret Thatcher's term in office, which led to a lot of industry shutting down. And I honestly can't remember his name, but there was a Conservative Party politician at the time who said the problem with doing this is because it was a very deliberate choice on the part of the government to deindustrialize Britain. They did not like the fact that labor unions had power. They did not like the fact that working class communities had power. They wanted to reassert management's right to manage, and sort of deliberately suppress the bargaining power of the organized working class. And deindustrialization was part of this trend of preparing us for the globalized economy. But this conservative politician said the problem is that once you have gotten rid of the industry, it's so dependent on very specific skills and technology and infrastructure that once you get rid of it, it's impossible to bring it back. And I think that's the problem is we're in this position now. I just don't think you can, reindustrialize the north of England or reindustrialize the Rust Belt. Those jobs, those communities are gone. And this whole debate about tariffs, I think, really, do we want tariffs or do we want free trade? Do we want globalization or national capitalism? The whole debate really is incredibly futile because what the socialists would say about this is whether you choose free trade or protectionism, the end result is still the same. You cannot stop the logical operation of the capitalist economy according to certain principles. It has, certain underlying laws based on the profit motive. Decisions under capitalism are made to maximize profit, not to benefit human beings, not to provide for basic needs, not to give people a good quality of life, no, but to maximize profit. And protectionism and free trade are both flawed ideas because they think that governments can intervene in the market and essentially decide how capitalism is going to operate. America could not solve the problems of the Rust Belt by putting tariffs on Chinese steel because all you're doing by doing that is you're kicking the can down the road, you're stocking up problems for the future. Any decision which hampers the profit motive under capitalism is contributing to, how should I put it, to the next financial crisis, if you like. You try to impede the profit motive and channel it in certain directions. Well, the global economy doesn't really work like that. It will just spring up other problems in different areas. Basically, take tariffs, for example. You put tariffs on goods, you're rising prices. If you increase prices, people can't afford to buy as much. You reduce demand, and then suddenly factories have less of a market to sell to, and you get a slump. But conversely, if you have free trade like we're moving towards at the moment, the opposite problem occurs, which is you glut the market with produce from the workshops of the world in China and India. That pushes down prices, which again cuts into profit margins of businesses. It's sort of you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Whatever happens, the boom and bust cycle that exists under capitalism is going to keep on, existing. You cannot try and fiddle your way out of the fundamental capitalist cycle of boom and bust. And I think that's the problem with a lot of these political ideas about, what we do about foreign businesses and so on, is there's this complete failure on the part of governments to recognize that capitalism just works like that. And you can't really try to impede it. And maybe that's a failure in the system, but at the very least, we should be honest about that. I don't think, any political idea about free trade or protectionism will in the long term solve the problems. All it can do is make further problems for the future.
Yeah, no, that all makes sense. It's definitely a tricky balancing act. To circle back to tuition, because we kind of went down the rabbit hole a little bit there. But it was all good conversation. So is the idea then, at least in Britain, that 9K kind of still exists to the schools, but you just kind of remove the aspect where the person is to pay it back to the government afterwards. So it's just a sole transaction then between the school and the government, and you just remove the loan portion to the person instead.
I think the way it
the
would
school,
work. Oh, go on.
Sorry, because the schools obviously still have to make money, right? They have employees that they have to pay. They have R&D. They have buildings and stuff that all cost money. So at the end of the day, it's not like money's being removed from the system. So the money's got to come from somewhere, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. But it should be run as a public good. And universities in Britain are, well, they're sort of quasi-public entities. They have sort of duties of public authorities in a sense, and they're a public institution. They're not privatized. Really, what the suggestion is cut out the middleman, which is the tuition fees, and have it funded by the government through taxation instead of burdening the individual students. And I must say, the student fee system is not very profitable because of these problems in the economy with the huge amount of graduates we have. Most, or well, maybe most is an overestimate. I would have to look up the figures, but a large proportion of people who go to university aren't paying back the loans anyway, because like I said, it sort of works like a graduate tax. You only pay as a percentage of your salary. Most of the tuition fees get written off anyway. And it doesn't work for the universities, it doesn't work for the students. What the sort of British left wing say is, what the Labour Party was saying is, the government should step in and fund it directly through taxation, and then all the needs of universities could be met straight from the public purse, instead of having this very sort of inefficient and patchwork system of this government loan scheme. That effectively it's more trouble than it's worth, and it should just be funded directly by the state.
Okay, that makes sense. So basically, secondary school universities would be treated just like first through 12th grade is treated.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. And what's interesting, and this is my knowledge as a lawyer kicking in, is you have the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, which is a treaty signed in the 1960s by various different countries, including Britain and including America. And one of the articles of the treaty says you must have you must provide university education. It doesn't have to be free to start with, but governments must progressively work towards making it free for the users, for the students. Interestingly, in Britain, we've actually gone back on that. I would say we've outright violated the terms of the treaty by introducing tuition fees. We didn't used to have a fee system. We had a system of grants. No fees. Universities were funded by the government for all essential purposes, and students got a maintenance grant which covered their living expenses. We went back on that under Tony Blair. It was a real step in the wrong direction for our society. I think it was the devaluing of education as a public good, and I think it's had tragic consequences for higher education in this country.
In the U.S., there are some schools that exist solely for profit. In Britain, how are universities structured there? Is there like any kind of board that is, at the end of the day, whatever profit is made is going to them? The dean, is there a sole entity that owns some of the universities there? After, expenses are paid, everything's covered, where does that excess money go? And if it is going to somebody or a group of people, and you do make that secondary school free to everyone to attend, how do you almost kind of buy those people out to make that service public? How do you get them to step aside?
I don't know any specifics about how universities are governed, I'm afraid. But I believe that they are run uh, as sort of charitable trusts. There's very specific regulations for charities in the UK. If you have a trust, you have a board of trustees who take decisions on behalf of it, but they are legally obligated to use all the resources of the trust, all the monies that trusts have, and this would include educational trusts that govern the universities. They're legally obligated to use their money to meet the purpose for which the trust was set up. So, um, my college, Christchurch, um, which is part of the University of Oxford, was run by a trust, and they had several trustees who would meet collectively to make decisions, but legally obligated to solely use the resources to promote the educational principles of the college. If anybody had been taking profit from that would have been a violation of the terms of the trust. No, there's no for-profit education really in the UK. None that I'm aware of to speak of. Yeah.
Is there any plans for if everything is nationalized and becomes free, any kind of forgiveness for those that have already went and they're currently making payments back on those grants, and then for maybe people that have paid back their grant in full, recouping any of that money, or just kind of, here's a new starting line, we're going to press from here?
Now I'm pretty sure that the position of the Labour Party here was that it would be, as you say, to draw a new starting line and to have nobody pay beyond that. I think they were looking into what to do with people who were had already paid it back, but I think it was to write off current debts and to not create any new ones, but not to reimburse those who had already paid them off.
Yeah, I know that's a big thing over here in the US. I don't know how much of the news cycle here makes it over there, but Biden,
Quite a lot, funnily enough, quite a lot.
Biden has been pushing a 10K student debt forgiveness plan. That's been kind of spinning the wheels for a little bit now. And so like personally, my wife is still in school, and we pay out of pocket. We don't take on, we're in a fortunate enough position to not have to take on any debt for her schooling, based on, she still works while going to school. I obviously have a full-time job. We can afford to foot that bill. But
What
to me,
is she studying, out of curiosity?
So she's going to school for dental hygiene.
Oh, fantastic.
Yep. So basically, in my eyes, what you do for one, you should do for all. Everything's fair and equitable. And in my opinion, when it comes to handouts, not trying to make it sound derogatory, but a handout. So if you're going to forgive somebody's 10 grand in student loan debt, and my wife doesn't have any student loan debt, but I have paid more than 10 grand, why am I not getting 10 grand back? Kind of thing. I understand, there's people not as well off as me, but there's also people that are more well off than me that also take on that debt, and they're going to get that 10K back. So
Yeah.
I wasn't, that's a big thing here right now. That's why I brought up the whole, in Britain, would it be a new starting line, or would there be any chance for those that have already been down that road to recoup stuff?
I think the problem is that, well, whatever policy you have, and it doesn't just apply to tuition fees, it applies to really all welfare or all social security type decisions. You have to fundamentally draw the line somewhere. If you're going to have welfare under capitalism, if you're going to have handouts, you have to draw the line somewhere. And there's always going to be people who don't benefit from a policy. You can debate where to draw that line. Should it be more generous or less generous? But really, capitalist governments are, to a certain extent, constrained by what is economically feasible. That they can't just spend willy-nilly. you have to have certain limits to it. And I think it was a pragmatic concession here by the Labour Party to say, well, you know, we can't, give money to people who've already paid, but we can stop people from having to go through this in the future. And as a starting point, I don't think that's a bad starting point, in terms of education policy. But it's interesting you mention it. I'd love to go off on a tangent, if you'll forgive me, that you've sort of raised.
Yeah, no, go for it.
Yeah, I think, personally, I am a socialist, and I'd love to talk in a bit more detail about exactly what that means to me later on, hopefully. But really, if you're a socialist, a full-on socialist, you sort of recognize the futility of having these kinds of policies at all under capitalism. Because, like I was saying earlier, the market operates in accordance with certain logical, essentially cast iron laws that no government of any ideological color can get around. It doesn't matter if it's the Republicans or the Democrats or the Tories or the Labour Party or whoever else. All of the political, elites, the government, whatever, they all have to abide by the limitations of the market. And if you have, welfare policies, really what you can do with those is very, very constrained by capitalism. If you go back to the 1950s, 40s, 50s, after the Second World War, basically the entire Western world made a pledge to never again let something like Nazism happen, never let the Great Depression happen again. And for 30 years, politics was dominated by the ideas of Keynesianism, or some kind of Keynesianism about tax and spend, tax the rich and redistribute it a little bit fairer, in a little bit more fairer manner to the rest of society. And these were really the golden years, the least unequal time in human history. You had a lot more social mobility in some ways than we do now. Real opportunities for working class people, strong labor unions, annual wage increases, the golden years, and really the birth of consumerism as well. But what we discovered in the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s was that good things can't last forever. And the whole sort of failure of the post-war social democratic project all across Europe, all across North America to try and create higher living standards under capitalism, I think really it's failed. And the reason it's failed, I would say, speaking as a socialist, is because governments tried to challenge the laws of capitalism without actually moving beyond capitalism itself. And the reason why I'm talking about this is, you mentioned with tuition fees, where do you draw the line? Really, under a capitalist global economy, the scope for democratic decision making is incredibly limited, because every politician, when they're thinking, what do we want to provide for people? What social services, what, welfare programs do we want to provide for people? In the back of their mind, they're constantly thinking about, well, where's the money coming from? What about the checkbook? How will the markets react to this? And it's a very crazy system where the entire political classes of the capitalist world, which really is the entire world these days, are essentially not making decisions that represent the views or interests of their constituents, but are being pushed and pulled around by an alien, concept of a market, millions and millions of financial transactions every day that governments have to pay attention to. That's not democracy. And people will always lose out from this so long as we have this system where decisions are being made for the purpose of protecting and expanding profit and capital accumulation, instead of meeting the basic, or well, not just the basic, but meeting the human needs of individual people. The two things are incompatible so long as you have a capitalist economic system. And yes, we can, gripe about how unfair it is to have a means test and so on, but unless we're actually willing to challenge the basis of the system itself, well, we get what we pay for, which is politicians making decisions on behalf of Wall Street and the City of London, not on behalf of the likes of you and me.
Yeah, no, that was all really good, and I think a good segue into the wealth distribution aspect that you brought up in the beginning. What exactly does that look like? What is the plan for that when it comes to implementation? How do you plan on getting people's buy-in?
So I'd love to start off with some statistics, if that's okay with you.
Yep, for sure.
According to the liberal economist Thomas Piketty, I gather, very well regarded internationally, French economist. But according to him, between 1980 and 2018, the top global 1% captured 27% of global income growth, whereas by contrast, the bottom 50% of people captured only 12% of income growth over the last couple of decades. According to the World Inequality Report published this year, 1%, the top 1% of the population owns 38% of the world's wealth. The bottom 50%, and we're talking a good 3.5 billion people here, earn only 2% of the world's wealth.
Or not to cut you off, but for those statistics, do you know how they're measuring those numbers? Because I know, not just millionaires, but billionaires in the US catch a lot of press over the amount of, wealth they've obviously accumulated, right? And a lot of people in the US have, stated they should pay wealth tax on, 90% of their wealth. But when you have people like, say, Elon Musk, who has companies like Tesla and SpaceX and stuff, he might be worth billions of dollars, but it's not like he has billions of dollars in bank accounts across different entities, right? That wealth is derived from his ownership of those companies. So do you know where they're getting those statistics from? Like, is that purely liquid assets, or where are they deriving that?
I'm glad you mentioned the word ownership, by the way. I'll come back to that. I don't know exactly how they're calculating the statistics. All I can do is cite my sources. For Piketty, it's the book Capital and Ideology, published in 2020, which I recently had the opportunity to read. And the World Inequality Report is an annual report published by the Paris-based World Inequality Lab. And I can send you the resources. I can't tell you exactly how they're calculating those figures, but I imagine, exactly as you say, it's not referring to bank accounts. It's referring to, ownership of valuable assets like shares, stake in a company, etc. I imagine that would be included.
Do you think if that is the case, at this point, we're just speculating, right? Because we're not sure 100% where they got the numbers from. If that is the case, do you think that's a fair assessment to kind of almost like a skewing of the numbers on paper? Because especially while we still exist in a highly capitalist environment, it's incentivized to, start companies and stuff. And then kind of that payoff is you have this company that's worth so much money, but unless you divest and step away from the company, you're not really able to access that liquidity.
I do think it's fair because it's relational. The point I'm citing these statistics to prove, I'm not saying it's fair or unfair that this exists. I'm simply pointing out that the world today is a very unequal place. The top 1% owns 38% of the total wealth. Well, whether that includes stocks and shares and ownership of assets or not, that is still an extreme disparity when the bottom several billions own 2% of the total wealth. it's going to be calculated in the same way for the richest and the poorest. The point is, look at the disparity between the top and the bottom. That exists regardless of how we calculate it.
So when you see that large disparity and in an attempt to correct that, you want to kind of level the playing field with redistributing assets?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. And it kind of, I could give you my answer, but I don't necessarily think that my answer would represent the view of the majority of people who call themselves socialists. So I think this might be a good opportunity to sort of go into a little bit what the word socialist actually means. Because, you know, like with many things, it has different definitions to different people.
Yeah, I feel like you get like the different camps too. You hear like Marxists, socialists, communists, democratic socialists. So even within the different kind of groups.
So perhaps I could spend, you know, a couple of minutes outlining some of the disagreements or the different types of, you know, socialist thought.
For sure.
Gosh. Well, socialism as a political movement really has existed for, say, the last 100 to 150 years. It's based on the Enlightenment ideas of rationality and very much a product of the intellectual Enlightenment. But at the same time, it was formed as a response to the Industrial Revolution, which, yes, created modern industry and, you know, modern science, but also came at a huge, huge social cost to the majority of the world's population, or the majority of the working class in these countries, like in Britain, who experienced terrible, terrible stress and dislocation as a result of capitalism, which really is a very new system in the history of humanity. Taking Britain as an example, capitalism was created when people were thrown off the land. You had the Enclosure Acts, which stripped people of their rights over common land, creating a large group of landless people who were forced to go and work in cities, in factories. You had the growth of industry and, you know, sort of the snowball effect into the industrial economy. So socialism is both an Enlightenment political ideology based on the values of equality and social justice, but it's also a very material reaction, sort of an instinctive or innate reaction on the part of ordinary people, ordinary men and women and so on, who were experiencing really an incredibly brutal and dislocating imposition of a new kind of economy that ripped up the social fabric of their lives and created something very, very chaotic and very, very unequal, I suppose, in its place. Not to say that inequality didn't exist before that, but looking at the socialist movement over, say, the past 100 years, really, I think you can split it into sort of roughly three groups that have been inspired by the writings of Karl Marx, who is, of course, the founding father of socialism as we understand it today. On the one hand, you have social democracy, which is prevalent in the sort of centre-left political parties, so the Labour Party in Britain, the Social Democratic Party in Germany, Socialist Party in France, and I think it's this kind of socialism which someone like Bernie Sanders is referring to when he uses the word. And social democracy is based on the idea of reformism, that we can change the system by changing individual aspects of it, by passing laws, by, you know, changing the tax code to tax the rich, as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez would say. And they sort of had their heyday through the 1950s to the 1970s, really. It was the Social Democrats who were sort of setting the post-war agenda. In America, of course, the New Deal liberals, who were not socialists, but adopted many of the same policy views as European Social Democrats did, like, you know, public subsidies for healthcare, for education, labour union rights, and social welfare programs. So that's one idea of socialism. If somebody says socialism is what happens in Norway, you can be guaranteed that they're a social democrat. The other kind of socialism, quote, socialism, unquote, that has been prevalent is, of course, the kind of Leninism. And here we have to talk a bit about Russia and what happened in Eastern Europe. And of course, Leninism is essentially based on the idea of, I don't know, you might call it state socialism, the idea that the proletariat, the working class, should seize political power through armed force and establish a quote-unquote dictatorship of the proletariat, led by a vanguard party, and they see it as the job of this party to lead on behalf of the working class, not actually by the working class, but on behalf of the working class, to guide them towards the right principles and the right understanding of socialism. And that's where you get, the state control from and the political authoritarianism and repression. Now, of course, those two kinds of understanding socialism have been the most successful. Leninism adopted in the dictatorships of the Warsaw Pact and in China and in various other countries. Then social democracy adopted in Europe, in to some extent North America, and in a lot of other countries as well, like Salvador Allende, who was elected in Chile, was essentially a social democrat who wanted to reform capitalism to make it more humanitarian, until, of course, he was ousted in the CIA-backed coup by General Pinochet. But there is another kind of socialism as well, which, and of course, I should say I'm making very broad generalizations here, because if you wanted to, you could talk for hours about this, but yes, I'm losing some of the nuance. I'm painting with a broad brush here. But the third kind of socialism is what you would call impossibilism. And impossibilism is based on classical Marxist theory, and it rejects both of the other kinds of socialism and says that they are essentially futile. Of social democracy, the impossibilists would argue that, well, if you look at the past 70 years, it's failed to achieve its objectives. Precisely, I might add, for the reasons that a very, very right-wing economist like Milton Friedman noted, which is that the state is trying to interfere with the market, and you can't do that because that creates more problems than it solves. And here we are, here we are in the 2020s, still languishing with huge problems with inequality and poverty, and now climate change as well, and really social democracy, where it has taken political power democratically, has failed to address any of the fundamental issues that are plaguing our society. They've made things slightly better, but really it's a sticking plaster. And then of the Leninists, the Marxist-Leninist way of thinking, the impossibilists would say, well, that's equally futile because, well, A, they're not actually the will of the democratic majority, but also B, all they managed to create in Russia was some kind of state-controlled capitalism. You still had money, you still had markets, the buying and selling of commodities. Even in a political dictatorship with state control like the Soviet Union, they still had all the fundamental features that make capitalism what it is. And I think, you can have a debate between these different theories. I would not dismiss any sort of attempt to understand them, but personally, I sympathize quite strongly with the impossibilist school, which says, well, look, we've been trying these other two methods for the past 100 years, and neither of them have really been very successful at changing the way our society works. That's the history of socialism in brief.
Yeah, no, thank you for lining that out for everyone. And I'm sure, everyone understands there's a lot of nuances and things, and, 5-10 minutes, you can't break down an entire political platform, yet alone the kind of in-party differences that exist as well.
Yeah.
So being someone who subscribes to the impossibilist, impossibilist aspects of socialism, what does that kind of, I don't know if leveling the playing field is the correct word, or more so bringing up those that are more destitute in society to the rest of the world versus bringing people down to them, I would imagine is the goal. What does that look like?
I mean, really, what all socialists want fundamentally is an equal world where everybody has equal access to the things you need to live a good life. And I think that applies whatever kind of socialism you support. I mean, obviously, I don't agree with political authoritarianism as a way to achieve it, but even they were just trying to create a more just society, and it went terribly, terribly wrong. No socialist wants to make everybody equally poor. Every socialist wants to make people equally rich, and the whole basis of Marxist theory. If you go and read Marx, if you go and read Capital, his magnum opus, a very, very dense book, I wouldn't recommend it, but essentially, the whole point of Marxism is to say we have everything today we owe to the industrial development, the economic development of capitalism. All of the modern technology, the mod cons, the industrial economic progress. We've created the best system that has ever existed in the history of the world. But this has come at the cost of plunging millions, no, billions of people into poverty and into conditions of subservience where you are forced to, spend your days toiling away with very little to show for it. We should take the scientific and technological advances that have been given to us by capitalism and use it to satisfy the needs of human beings instead of what happens under a capitalist economy, which is where decisions are made specifically to increase profit. And Marx outlines this in Capital. He says, the profit motive is really central to the whole, it's the whole point of capitalism is more profit, the constant quest for the accumulation of capital. And the system goes round and round like that. And you have the boom and bust cycle, which interrupts it periodically. But the goal is the same, to accumulate as much wealth as possible. And this is great if your goal is to accumulate wealth. But it's not meeting the needs of people. And this is where I sort of draw on the statistics. 700 million people, according to the United Nations, live in poverty. And that is defined by them as living on less than, I think, about $2 a day. In 2015, it was reported that almost half of the global population live on less than $5 a day. According to the United Nations, again, 20,000 people die every day from hunger. 2 million people die a year from work-related causes, industrial accidents and mishaps that happen all the time and are so commonplace that we don't really even remark on them. But people are dying, people are suffering because of this global system, yet it's still the best thing we have. Well, why don't we take the technology we have and use it to get things to people who need them, to meet human needs, instead of simply enriching a minority of the human population at the expense of everybody else? That's the basic essence of the socialist argument.
So under that, is that funded through taxes? Is how do you accomplish getting them those means for a better life?
Well, again, this might be quite controversial to say because, again, there's a lot of disagreement amongst people who call themselves socialist. But if you go and read Marx, the solution, the prescription he outlines, again, speaking in very broad terms, is you have to get rid of the things that make capitalism what it is. You have to change the fundamental structure of the economic system. And in brief, the way you do this is by abolishing money altogether, abolishing private property, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment because that's a very controversial thing to say on its own. But abolishing money, abolishing private property, and also abolishing the state, which, according to the Marxist theory, is a product of the private property system in the first place. Now, just to clarify, by private property, socialists don't mean, one's personal possessions. They don't mean your house. They don't mean your car. They don't mean your family jewels or whatever. By private property, the socialists are specifically referring to social property, property that is necessary for production and distribution of resources. So you're talking transportation infrastructure, factories, mines, shipping, and so on and so forth. These things that are necessary to produce wealth and to distribute it. And in its place, the socialists want a system of society based on free and equal access to the things we need to live, which is organized democratically by the majority of the world's population making democratic decisions and essentially cooperating to ensure that this process is carried out smoothly. And there's no blueprint to it, really, because, we're not sitting here with a crystal ball. We can't predict the future. It has to be a decision of the majority of people to have this system, to implement it and to make it work. But the basis of it is cooperation in place of competition and social ownership of production instead of private ownership of production, and free and equal access instead of restricting it on the basis of money at all.
When it comes to making those services available to people, excuse me, sorry. How, obviously in our current system, someone owns the mine, someone owns the factory, and if it's looking for a system that abolishes money, is how do you get to that point? Do you let time play out till all the people that own those things are willing to come on board? Because they can't be compensated, obviously, if we're looking to move towards a social setting where money doesn't have to exist. And then if you're not willing to wait for them to come on board, however long that takes, and even if you did pay them, the end goal is to have no money, are they forcefully conscripted into the system against their will?
Again, a lot of different ideas about this. From this point on, all views are my own. I can speak only for myself based on my understanding of it. Mm-hmm. The way you do it, people with wealth and power in society have never voluntarily surrendered their wealth and power. All throughout human history, it's been the same case. That the people who control society quite like being able to control society. What needs to happen is for, first, the majority of human beings, the majority of people to decide that we want this system, this new system. And then you have to put people into power who are willing to bring it about and to have them essentially pass legislation, pass laws to socialize production, to do it democratically by the will of the conscious majority. And I think, the whole basis of democracy is majority decision making. You can't say fairer than that. It's the best thing we've come up with so far for dispute resolution. If the vast majority of people want to live in a world on the basis of social ownership, then we have to accept the outcome. You can't be a sore loser and say it's not fair. As for whether the wealthy would be conscripted into this system, I think using the word conscripted there is a very, very loaded term. We're not talking about forcing people to work. It's on the basis of cooperative work done by the whole of society, because that's what we do as people. People are not naturally entirely greedy and self-interested. We do believe in living in a society. We do work together as a species, and that's been the case all throughout human history, right the way back to when we were still hunter-gatherers. We're a cooperative species. And if the rich don't want to be a part of that system, there's nobody forcing them to. They can go out and do whatever they want on their own, so long as they don't disturb what the majority wants. I think it would be helpful to talk a bit about private property and what it is and where it comes from, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I think, in modern society, we have this sort of philosophical belief that private property is sacrosanct. It's the basis of all of Western liberal democracy. And philosophy right the way back to at least to the Enlightenment, which really centered the value of private property, right? But if you look at the history of private property, if you look at what it actually is and where it comes from, it is something that has been violently imposed on people without their consent. So taking the Industrial Revolution in England as an example, the only way they got, or one of the ways they got the Industrial Revolution to happen was by forcing people off of the land so they could privatize it. And that was the Enclosure Acts, which were passed by Parliament. You had people working on the land for themselves as individuals, making their own living off the land, and then Parliament, passed legislation to privatize it and give it to wealthy individual landowners to do with what they want. And suddenly the people who had been cooperating on that land became private tenants, entirely at the mercy of the landlords. Private property is not fundamentally conducive to freedom, because it is a relationship of power where the owner of private property, and again, I'm not talking about personal possessions, I'm talking about social property, the means of life. If you have one person controlling the means of life, then everybody who needs those things to live is under their domination. If one person owned all of the food in the world, we would have to do whatever they say to eat. Now, of course, under capitalism, it's not one person, it's a class of people. It's the capitalist class, if you will, if you want to use that word. You can call them whatever you want. Marx called them the bourgeoisie. But essentially, all the means of life are owned by this class of individuals. And everybody else has to play the game by their rules. We don't get a say in it. Work for us, do what you're told, or we'll kick you out on the street. You won't have a home to live in. You won't have food to eat. You won't have the shirt on your back if we say so. That is the basis of the relationship between man and man under the capitalist system. And it is a very authoritarian relationship. And what the socialists are saying is, in order to be free as individuals, to live our life as we choose, to live in a healthy democratic community on the basis of real human autonomy, you cannot have the private ownership of the means of subsistence. You have to eradicate that incredibly coercive relationship so that the rest of us, the majority of people, can live free and happy lives.
So, when it comes to, sorry, just trying to think. No. When it comes to saying it's a coercive relationship, right? And you have to play by the rules that are outlined, kind of, or, you get left out on the street. left to the elements, left to starve, what have you, left on your own. Isn't it kind of counterproductive to say that you're being coerced into this relationship when leading to socialism through democracy? It gets implemented with a majority vote. A lot of people will mention the tyrannical majority. Like, is 51% enough? Is 60%, 70%? What point do you call it a majority to implement these ideas to where you're just flipping the coin on who's being coerced into the system?
Well, it's not really flipping a coin, though, because the vast majority of the human population are in one way or another part of the working class. We have to work for a living. We have to play the game on those terms that are set for us by the people who own the productive resources, who own the social property. The vast majority of humankind are currently living under these conditions of subservience. And by the way, that also includes the majority of people in wealthy countries, in Britain, in America, in France and Germany, and even in Norway and Sweden. The people who possess the ownership, who have the ownership of the means of life, are comparatively a very small group of people. The question then for you is, well, we can talk about the tyranny of the majority, but what about what we currently have, which is the tyranny of the minority, where most of the people who live on this planet are being controlled and coerced by a small minority of the people who live on this planet? Is that fair? Is that right? That's the question we have to ask. Democracy is a very scary thing. Can we trust the people around us to make the right decisions? But it is a process of dispute resolution that we have come up with as a species that is accepted in large parts of the modern world because it is the fairest and most equitable solution, right? No decision is ever going to be unanimous, but you have to respect the democratic process. And
I think a lot of people have realized the pitfalls in democracy, though. And you see things like in the US, a constitutional republic that helps prevent certain measures from happening, like a tyrannical majority where 51 tells 49 what to do.
But again, we're not talking about that. And the problem is, under capitalism, we have a system where a very small amount of people have control over a very large amount of people. That's not right either. The tyranny of the minority is something far more real, is a much more present danger right now than any supposed tyranny of the majority that might exist at some point in the future. And really, you have to ask yourself, is this a system of private property right? Is it fair? Is it just? Is it efficient? Is it rational? And if you ask those questions, I think the answer is no to all of those, right? What do we do about it? Yes, of course, the people who have ownership over these things will complain bitterly about it, but they are using their ownership of these things to coerce the rest of us. Surely it's not tyrannical to resist tyranny being imposed upon yourself. That's what the founding fathers stood for at the end of the day in America. And, we know they might not have lived up to their ideals. Yes, some of them owned slaves and so on, but it's the principle that matters, is people have a right to stand up to dictatorship and oppression. And if the majority of humanity choose to cast off the chains that bind them under capitalism and say, look, this isn't fair, you cannot exploit us in this manner, that's not tyrannical. That is liberation.
Wouldn't it be, couldn't you argue a lot of these places that are being taken advantage of, the people that live there, if you live under a dictatorship like North Korea, China, Russia. If you live in a still type of caste system like India, a theocracy like in the Middle East, a just very corrupt government like Mexico, that these people could take measures into their own hands. That end of the day, ultimate freedom is to succeed or falter on your own. Maybe society could provide certain safety nets where failure doesn't end in homelessness and starvation, but at the end of the day, don't your rights kind of end where someone else's rights begin, and you try to force something on them for quote unquote social equality?
I absolutely agree that your rights end where someone else's begins. And I don't think any socialist, and not certainly not any socialist who knows what they're talking about, could possibly dispute that principle. But what rights here are we talking about? I think the problem with this very sort of right wing or capitalist way of putting it is it presumes that the right to private property is sacred. That's what I said at the start about it, the intellectual heritage of the Enlightenment and John Locke and Adam Smith and all that. Very much they presume that property is private property in the way I'm talking about it is an important right to protect, right? But what about the rights of the rest of us? What about the right to eat, the right to have your own house, to live a dignified life? The problem with the capitalist system is it does not create dignified standards of living for the majority of people, right? And the reason it doesn't is because of the existence of private property. Legally, private property is recognized as a right, but just because it's a legal right doesn't mean that it is something that should be valued or desired as a society. The problem with private property is that it's a form of control. So the capitalist class are exercising this control over the rest of us in a manner that is destructive to our right to live a free, independent, and dignified existence. If we genuinely believe as a society that our rights end where somebody else's rights begin, then we have to recognize that private property has to go because it is interfering with the rights of the vast majority of humankind to live that dignified existence, to live a free life in the manner of their choosing.
Why don't you think
in order to enrich the minority? Sorry, carry on.
Why can't the two exist side by side? So, like, why can't you have fully available public schools for people to attend, but still have a private option? Why can't we have, food that exists for people, but still have privately owned restaurants if people want that option? Why can't we have, if you want to go as far to say in this day and age, internet, cell phone, computers are all things somebody needs for a comfortable life, that we're beyond kind of that hunter-gatherer food and shelter needs of people these days? Why can't there be publicly available internet, cell phones, computers, stuff like this, but you still have people like Steve Jobs that go out and invent the iPhone, and there's these things for people to choose if they wish, but if they don't and they think somebody has a good idea and they want to participate in that good idea, why strip that from them?
Well, give me 1 second to think.
For sure.
Cheers. I'll try and address each of the things you've said separately. I think you raised a point about innovation. I'll come back to innovation at the end. Why can't the two coexist? Well, the idea of the mixed economy, which is part public and part private, is essentially what every Western liberal capitalist country adopted after the Second World War. In Britain, in America, it was New Deal liberalism. In Britain, it was the Labour government led by Clement Attlee, which nationalised 20% of the British economy. And you had similar projects forwarded by the left wing in France and Norway and all these other places. And they didn't work. If you want to know why the two can't exist, look at the history of the last 70 years. This kind of idea of a Keynesian mixed economy has been an abject failure. It broke down in the 1970s because we had inflation, we had strikes, we had various things going on. It was economically inefficient at the end of the day. The problem with capitalism, and really this is the point I've been trying to emphasize all along, is you can't argue with the logic of the market. Once you have a market system, a capitalist market system at a global level, it imposes its will upon the whole global society, and there's no politician that can interfere with that, because as soon as you start interfering with the profit motive, as soon as you start taxing the rich, as soon as you start bringing in red tape and regulations, you're eating into the profit motive, which just creates its own problems. Social democracy, the social democratic mixed economy failed in the 1980s, and we've not gone back to it since. And one thing where socialists agree with sort of neoliberals on this, the sort of new right, is we both recognize that this system that we tried does not work, that the two can't coexist. Going back to specifically private property, why can't people choose to have private property? Well, private property is a very specific product of history. It developed over thousands and thousands of years. It's existed in a different form in each age of society. In the Middle Ages, it was very different to what it was in the 1800s. You can't have a socialist society with private property because it's sort of definitionally incompatible with it. The thing that socialists are arguing for is a world of free and equal access to the produce of production conducted on a social scale in order to meet the needs of individuals. It's not that private property can't exist. It's that it can't exist within a socialist system, and socialism can't exist within a capitalist system. We have to make a choice. Under socialism, you have no private property, but that's not really a loss to anyone because production is owned socially by the whole human race, and distribution is directed at meeting the needs of human beings, right? Why would you have private ownership of factories in that kind of world? Once you step outside of the frame of reference, which is sort of the capitalist ideology, which is so tied in with the idea of money and markets and private profit, once you step outside of that and recognize that it's inefficient, that it's irrational, that it's not meeting the purpose it was designed for. I use the word designed loosely, of course, again, slow historical development, but it's not fulfilling human needs. Once you accept those points, the whole system of private property, which is a legal institution, which is a social institution, becomes entirely unnecessary. If you think freedom is tied up with owning property, well, fair enough. Under capitalism, it is because money is power. But that's not real human freedom. That's not the kind of human freedom that we should be aspiring for as a society. It comes wrapped in chains.
Is there any concern over potential stagnation where people are just kind of happy with what they have, and because it's almost decentivized to be revolutionary in your ideas of what is possible to be done, you don't see the next Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk. I know these are all very American centric people I'm bringing up.
Richard Branson.
But, you get what is the incentive to build something great just for it to be taken from you and given to the public? Because at a certain point, obviously that's going to be seen as the new baseline commodity for people to achieve a nice lifestyle. Like, depending on what point in time, you would argue now everyone should have a car based on the country you live in and how the cities are laid out. Somebody living in Montana, it's just not realistic for them to not own a car versus, LA, New York, London, what have you. 50 years ago, no one would have thought everyone should have a cell phone or access to the internet or what those things even were. So as the march of time and technology continues, seems like innovation would probably still continue, but not to the same extent, because almost kind of like, what's the point? I got what I got. I'm good. I got friends, family, hobbies. I got the necessities. I'm good to go. Even if I did pursue something, it would just be, taken from me for the betterment of society anyways. So what's the point?
It's a fair criticism that many people raise against socialism, is this whole innovation argument. And obviously, capitalism has been integral to the innovation of the last 150 years. We have capitalist innovation to thank for the things we take for granted today. There's no doubt about that. But innovation has been with us for the whole of human history, and it's not going to go away just because we change the basis of society. Innovation was not created by capitalism, and the end of capitalism is not the end of innovation. Human beings are naturally creative. We create because it's in our fundamental human nature to create new things, to bring new things to the world. Science has gone on for as long as human beings have existed, and there's no reason it should end just because you take the profit motive out of it. And by the way, I think the idea that socialism is about taking things off people and giving them to everyone else, that's not what socialism is about at all.
Isn't that realistically? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. But isn't that really what it is about? It's about the haves and have-nots, and taking the haves from the haves to redistribute to the have-nots to level that playing field. At the end of the day, in order to bring people at a lower rung on the social economic ladder to a level playing field, we do live in a world of finite resources. So therefore, there has to be a cap on luxurious lifestyles, what have you, to make sure everyone is afforded the same opportunities. So for that to be said, billionaires can't exist, millionaires can't exist, sprawling estates, all these things can no longer exist for the sake of the betterment of society, to make sure no one's living in a destitute lifestyle.
Again, this is another common argument against socialism, and if it were true, I'd agree with you completely. But obviously, resources are finite. There's no infinite resources, but there is the technological capacity existing right now to meet all of the needs of human beings, to provide enough food for everyone, enough clothes, enough houses, enough culture. And I'm not just talking about the austere basics. I'm talking about the things that make life good, the things that make life worth living. Capitalism has already given us the technology to meet human needs. So yes, there's no infinity, but neither is there any genuine scarcity in the world today, really, to speak of. The scarcity that exists in the world today is a product of the system of private property and the system of money, which says if you don't pay, you can't have it. This is why we have such extreme levels of poverty today, even now after the last 150 years of progress, why we're still dealing with all these social problems is because of the structure, the legal institutional structure of private property and money. We can meet the needs of people without taking anything away from others if we choose to do that. But we can't choose to do that in a world where the sole criterion for having your needs met is having enough money to pay for it. And that kind of capitalist freedom is only possible if you accept the argument that private property is a kind of freedom, which the socialists would strongly contest and say, no, actually, the system of private property works as a form of coercion, that if you've got no bargaining power, you're essentially some kind of a slave, if you will. Very strong language, I know, but it really is a kind of domination of the individual. And anybody who's worked on an assembly line or anybody who's worked, in your average job will probably feel some sense of that in their day-to-day lives. Just ask yourself, at work, are you really as free as you could be? Are you really getting everything out of life that you should be? Why aren't you? But to circle back to the question you asked and to try and get at the meat of the issue, we don't need to define our human relationships by artificial money scarcity. And scarcity really is only a problem if you accept the idea that people who can't afford a good life should not have a good life. Look at the amount of waste we have. Look at the industrial capacity we have. Look at the technology we have. And then ask yourself, are we using the technology we have as a species in the most efficient way possible if the goal of having such technology is to meet human needs? The answer will be no. No, we are not. And the reason for that is private property and money. I understand the concern about scarcity. Really, all of human history, and I think Karl Marx himself made this point, all of human history is an attempt by human beings to create distance between ourselves and the elements, hunger, thirst, cold, and so on. That's really the entire history of the human species, has been working towards some kind of progress understood as, the technological and economic advancement of humanity. But really, since capitalism, we've not had we've not had genuine scarcity as a serious threat. And, the problems that arise in the future about scarcity are problems we would have to meet as a species under any social system, be it capitalism or socialism or something entirely different. The choice we have to make is, do we want money and private property and artificial scarcity, or do we want to live in a world of abundance where everybody can have the things they need to survive? It's not about taking from the top to give to the bottom. It's not about being a Robin Hood. It's about saying we can use the technology we have, automation, self-driving cars. These things are really, ChatGPT, artificial intelligence. These things are really picking up speed. And the more we have these technologies, the easier it will become. What we need to do now is revolutionize our social and legal institutions, so money, private property, the laws around a system which uses those technologies in the most rational way to satisfy the needs of human beings. That's what it's about.
After everything's put in place, obviously you'll still have people that do things because they love to do those things. How do you prevent people from not doing anything? Because I feel like it does it a disservice to say that people, once all their needs are met, will stop doing anything, when currently the end goal of everyone is to make it to a point in life where they can retire and not have to do anything and, go on trips and,
Yeah.
toil and hobbies that they enjoy and stuff. So how do we keep the factories turning? How do we keep the assembly lines moving? How do we keep the lights on? How do we keep food production going when, if you're able to implement overnight, everyone's needs to be met and they could kind of hit this retirement scenario?
I'm so glad you asked me this question. um, well, let me turn the question on its head. I will answer you, but I want to answer it in a specific way, and hopefully it will be clear why. So there's a book written by a French socialist called Paul Lafargue in the 1880s. He was Karl Marx's son-in-law. He was the leader of, I think, the first French Socialist Party, or the first Marxist French Socialist Party. And the book is called The Right to be Lazy. And in the book, I thoroughly recommend it, even if you're not a socialist. It's a great read. It will give you something to think about, and it's a very short book. But in the book, he makes the argument essentially that human beings are doing too much work under capitalism because capitalism forces us to do more work than we could ever possibly have need of doing, not because it's necessary, but because it's profitable. And he's very critical of it's a satire. He's very mock critical of working people for having this enormous desire to work so hard. But essentially, the argument socialists make is the argument that Paul Lafargue makes. With the technology we have today and the technology we're about to have in the next 10, 15 years, most of the work that we're currently doing is really unnecessary. Again, if the object of society is meeting human needs instead of making money. Think of, just to take one example, think of how many jobs would not be necessary if you did not have money and if you did not have the profit motive. So banking, finance, call centers, advertising executives, public relations managers, politicians, they could be the first to go, a lot of bureaucrats, a lot of industrial jobs will be rendered unnecessary by automation in the next 10 years, 15 years. A lot of white collar jobs will be rendered a lot easier by artificial intelligence. And, ChatGPT is the latest and scariest example. Oh, now they're coming for the estate agents and the lawyers, and the machines are going to take over the world. But when you combine the productive technology to automate production with the amount of unnecessary work we're doing currently, really the amount of work that we need to do to meet human needs, to keep the lights on, to keep the factories running and so on, is tiny as a fraction of the amount of work we are doing. If you got rid of all the unnecessary jobs that exist today under capitalism, it would be a human tragedy of epic proportions, because all of those people currently doing those jobs would suffer unemployment, suffer poverty, they would go hungry, they would lose their home, right? But technology is not fundamentally a threat to the human species. It's something we can use to make our lives easier. And if you get rid of the profit motive, if you get rid of private property, and if you get rid of money, and you say to people you can have free access to the resources you need to live, then we could reduce the working week to a couple of hours. Say, I don't know, you'd have to fund research into this to be able to give exact figures, but we could work 10 hours a week. And then if technology gets better, we could work 6 hours a week. And then 4 hours. Now, socialism will only happen if a majority of people decide that they want socialism to exist. And if they accept that system and they're willing to live within it. But let me ask you this. Would you be willing to work 10 hours a week so that the rest of your time could be your own? Is that a bargain you're willing to make? I think that most people who are working 40, 50, 60 plus hours a week now would take that deal in a heartbeat. I think fundamentally humans are cooperative. We are willing to work together to get things done. But if we had a socialist society, we could do that, and we could work to a much smaller extent than we are now with the technology we have available and with the abolition of unproductive work that is purely exists because profit needs it to exist, not because human beings need it to exist. So I think that's my answer to your question, is the amount of work we're doing is already too much. And you have more people doing the same jobs for a shorter amount of time. It's a perfectly feasible system. I don't know. Would you be willing to take that deal?
Personally, I don't think I would. Even if I only had to work 10 hours a week and then was left to do with what I wish the rest of my time, 1 hour a week, get crazy with it. Yeah. It seems like, and maybe I'm just stretching to fit into a narrative here. So let me know if I'm wrong. Well, I'm not going to the movies because the movies are for profit. I'm not going boating or fishing or hunting because the gear I need to do that is for profit. I'm not going and doing a number of activities because the economy that exists around those activities is solely for profit. And we obviously already produce enough food and things for everyone in the world, so we don't need more people to be farmers and stuff. But then you ask them to go farm and do these essential tasks for the functioning of the society the way it would be restructured. If John Doe doesn't want to go farm, is he allowed to just not do that? He doesn't have to contribute anything? Is he just free to enjoy the labors of others at that point? I know that's kind of a two-part thing now that you got to unpack.
Yeah, I'll respond to them in order. On the first part, well, you talk about the movies being for profit and other things being for profit. Well, they are under capitalism, but again, we're talking about changing the basis of society. None of these activities need to be conducted for profit, and in a world without private property, and again understood as social property, not individual possessions, in a world without private property, in a world without money, there would be no restriction on your ability to do these things. Again, socialism is kind of an all or nothing thing. Either you live in a socialist world or a capitalist world. You can't really mix and match. So if we did actually live in a socialist society, you would still have cinemas, you would still have theaters, you'd still be able to go and hunt, you could sling your rifle over your shoulder. I mean, we don't really have guns in Britain, I must say, but you could do these kinds of things perfectly easily. The point is to remove how do I put it? The point is they're being done in a different manner, not that these things are not being done at all.
So how does, just for a very easy scenario, how does the movies operate under socialism? Who's working the concession stand? Who's making the movies? Who's handling distribution? Who owns the movie theater? If, in the US, if there's no AMC movie theaters, because there's no company, there's no CEO.
Well, first off, let's remember this is a world where we're doing less work already because we've embraced automation, we've closed down the banks, we've gotten rid of the work that is purely tied up with the money system. And so people are working much less and have a lot more free time, right? If you want to go out and make movies, there's nothing stopping you from doing that, because you don't have to spend 40, 50 hours of your life every week doing a job for someone who doesn't care about you so they can go and buy a third yacht. You're using your own time as an individual to do the things that you want to do that make your life meaningful. There are plenty of people out there. Just look at all the aspiring actors and actresses and film directors in the world. Do you think if you gave those people a camera and said, go out and make some movies, that they'd sit around and say, oh, hang on a second, no, we can't do that because we're not getting paid? No, of course not. When you take care of people's basic needs, when you take care of the needs people have to satisfy in order to live, you're unleashing the creative potential of human beings at its highest level. And so you will see a lot more art and a lot more culture and a lot more freedom of expression than people have now. Because we're a naturally creative species. Just like we're naturally innovative, we're also naturally creative. We love singing and dancing and making art. It's part of who we are. You will see a flourishing of culture and entertainment in a way that really has never existed before in human history, because we've all been spending all of our time working within this money system. But you give people the means to express themselves and they will. Who's working the ticket stand? Well, nobody is, because you don't need to pay to get in. You can have as many people as there are seats, really, and if there are any disputes about who sits where, they can sort it out like reasonable adults. As for the question about where you have the cinema, well, that's a decision of the local community. You can put it on any empty lot you choose, really. Why not set up your own cinema on a vacant piece of land? There's nothing to stop you. The hurdles to us being able to live fulfilled, free, satisfying lives are predominantly the problem of the money system and the profit system, not anything natural, not any natural inhibitions in human beings ourselves. If you give people the opportunity to be creative and to have fun, trust me, we'll go out and have fun. I think there's no limit to the human potential for creativity.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Then I completely forgot. Second point. People that do not want to participate in the system because their needs are now met. How do you counteract that? If you have to at all, and if you do, how do you incentivize people still participating in the system when all their needs and everything are met and they've kind of hit in that retirement phase, for back a little words, but for kind of what we have now?
Yeah. I think there's a couple of points I would make in response to that. Firstly, people are not naturally lazy. I think under capitalism, you work 40, 50, however many hours a week. And then in the small amount of free time you have, you do nothing at all because it's your way of recharging from the week you've just had. But really, I think people are very restless. If you put somebody in a room with nothing to do, they'd go mad in a couple of hours. People are naturally creative, naturally innovative. Socialism does not hamper that. It's not about removing the incentive for people to do things. It's just saying there are other reasons that people do things than making a quick buck. If you meet people's basic needs, they're not going to stop doing things. They're going to do more than they have ever done before. They're going to go out and look for things to do. They're going to create things. And it's also about changing the things we value. Under capitalism, we value certain things like material possessions, and a socialist is not somebody who believes we should all live a puritanical, austere lifestyle. You can still have material goods under a socialist society, but they're not the only thing that matters to people. There's also art, science, culture, education, understanding. And when you give people the basic goods they need to live as a matter of right, you find you will find a flourishing of human creative freedom in all sorts of different directions. People will take up practice in the arts, people will study, people will make artisanal goods in workshops, collaboratively, because people don't work alone, and we're perfectly capable of cooperating on projects without money, without private profit. So that's one argument. People naturally do things. We're not naturally lazy as a species. If we are lazy, it's because the system encourages laziness in our free time, because what else are you going to do on a Sunday night when you've got work the next morning? But also the problem of free riders. Yeah, again, this is another critique or argument against socialism, if you will, is, what happens if you have very few people actually doing the work, and the rest of them just sort of riding on the coattails of the few hardworking ones? And it's a fair concern to have. There's two things I'd say in response. One is, well, first, I think we have to talk about the free riders under capitalism, which is, and there are plenty of them, which is this tiny minority of people at the top of society whose sole contribution is that they have a piece of paper saying they own a company, or they own a piece of land, and they charge rent to live on the land, and they take all the profits of the company and distribute it amongst the various shareholders, but they're not contributing to society.
But could you argue that the fact that they, in many cases, founded that company is their contribution to society?
Well, you can found a company and register it and set it up and get a piece of paper saying you founded a company, but at the end of the day, you're not the one that is actually doing the valuable work of the company. The people doing the valuable work are the ones who, make the products that you're selling, who drive them to the warehouse, who ship them out. As a Marxist, I subscribe to the labor theory of value, which was actually not an invention of Karl Marx. It was pioneered by Adam Smith, the founder of capitalist economics, and adopted by David Ricardo, an important figure in capitalist political economy in the early 1800s. Karl Marx simply adopted their theory. But the labor theory of value says the value of a commodity comes from the combination of natural resources and labor, human effort, expenditure of energy, which has been spent on turning these raw resources into a commodity for sale. Under capitalism, that is the source of economic value. It's the exchange of commodities which are created from the labor of human beings. So really, the value in companies under capitalism does not come from the people who set them up, albeit they play an important administrative role. But the real value, the economic value, comes from the people who are doing the work. And this is really why the capitalist system is exploitative, is because the majority of the people doing the work don't really see any real return for the work that they're doing. Sure, they get paid a wage, which gives them enough to live on for the week, to wake up every morning and go to work, but they're not getting the fruits of their labor because of the system of private property that's taken by the owner of the company, by the shareholders. This is the whole basis of the socialist argument, that the relationships of property under capitalism are fundamentally exploitative. But sure, you can say that someone like Richard Branson, the British billionaire, or Bill Gates or Elon Musk have done a very good thing in setting up a company, but they're not the ones who keep it running. They're the ones that take the profit, but they're not the ones that make it what it is, that make it successful.
Well, could you argue, because Richard Branson's he's T-Mobile, right? He's like in cell phone.
Oh, is he? I'm not sure. I know him from Virgin Media in the UK, and he owns some railway companies and stuff like that.
I could be 100% wrong, but I want to say T-Mobile. I'm sure somebody
possibly
will look it up. But why, if it's a very simple, straightforward thing, is just establishing the company, and the exploitative nature of capitalism kind of takes care of the rest, why isn't there thousands of these guys, like a copy and paste clone? If it's that easy, why doesn't everyone do it? And then to say that there's a small minority that benefit from the system and don't really do anything, I can only speak on the US in this aspect, but around 10% of the US population has a net worth of $1 million or more. And of that 10%, only 20% is from generational wealth. So the 80% of people in the United States with a net worth of $1 million or more, for all intents and purposes, are self-made because they did not inherit their fortune.
Sorry, did you say 1 million or 1 billion?
1 million or more.
Okay.
1 billion, that'd be crazy.
Well,
that'd be
yeah.
I believe there is just under 1,000 billionaires in the United States, but for a net worth of $1 million or more, it's around 10% of the U.S. population.
Well, I don't know about in the US, but I think in general, being a millionaire is not as hard as it used to be, really, because of inflation. The value of money has gone down. And I think that there are naturally just going to be a lot more millionaires because we have more money now, thanks to the government printing tons of it in the 70s and 80s. But yeah, okay. So most of them didn't inherit their wealth, you're saying. So arguably they're self-made men. Well, I think the answer to that lies in the fact that under the capitalist system, you have to have money to make money. The accumulation of capital grows and grows and grows. You know, you put in a small amount and then it goes through this process of the value of the money you put into a business goes into the commodities being made by it, and then those are sold for a profit, and the value comes back to the company. Whether you start with nothing or whether you inherit wealth and use it to set up in a company, the money to set up a company has to be coming from somewhere. It doesn't matter if it's your parents or a bank loan or whatever else, but you still have to have money in the first place to set up that business. And then we have to ask the question, well, where does that money come from? It's not just magicked out of thin air. It comes from somewhere else in the economy. And maybe the bank has taken it from the various deposits of people who've put money in the bank, and well, maybe they've got their money from companies that they have owned or operated. That those are still fundamentally, at the end of the day, going through the same cycle of commodity circulation. The fundamental point is that when you have a business, it doesn't matter where the money to set it up comes from, is that the business cycle of investing capital and then the capital being turned into saleable commodities, that is still fundamentally exploitative. Okay, some people are self-made men, but that doesn't change the fundamental nature of the relationship within the corporate structure. And another thing worth pointing out as well is I think it's glaringly obvious with the benefit of hindsight, but it's worth saying people like that, self-made men and so on, can only really be successful because the rest of us aren't. Because the rest of us are still poor or relatively poor, middle income, if you want to be diplomatic. The rest of us are still struggling to pay our bills, struggling to get by, and working for other people. Wealth and poverty have to exist side by side because wealth really is fundamentally relational. If everybody had the same, and that's not what socialists want, but if everybody had the same, there would be no poverty or inequality. As soon as somebody gets rich, they're taking that money from somewhere else, from somebody else. And that's why it's fundamentally exploitative, is because wealth and poverty always have to exist side by side under a money system, which capitalism definitely is. I hope that goes some way to answering your question, but feel free to follow up.
No, that was good. So at the end of the day, say it's even just one guy or girl taking a free ride. Is that one person okay to take that free ride, or is no one allowed to take a free ride? Is there a certain percentage we're looking at here? Because in my eyes, it's not so much about taking the free ride as making sure you don't breed discontent amongst the populace because somebody might be taking a free ride if it occurs.
Yeah. Sorry, I got completely sidetracked there.
No, you're good. I know I sidetracked us
and
too.
I forgot to circle back. Yeah, so if socialism was a system of free riders, it would be appalling and no one should support it. But I don't think that's what it's about. I mean, the reason why I wanted to talk about, I'm sorry, I was just moving my desk. The reason I wanted to talk about the sort of structure of business under capitalism is because I think it highlights the fact that, well, there are a lot of arguments that people make against socialism that are as equally applicable, if not more so, to capitalism. So we have this problem of free riders under capitalism, which is that if you're a regular schmuck and you've worked most of your life, at the end of it, you have very little to show for it, but you've made somebody else very, very rich, who's gotten rich off the back of the work that you have done for them. And you've done it for them because you didn't have a choice, because it was either you accept the contract terms I give you or you go and die in a gutter somewhere. So this free rider problem is a problem we're already dealing with. And the socialists say, well, we don't think that's right, that we think there shouldn't be free riders. There's a brilliant song called Bread and Roses. I don't know if you're familiar with it, that was sung at the 1912 Lawrence Textile Mills strike. It was an American strike. I don't know what state it was in, but it was organized by the Wobblies, by the IWW. And there's a line somewhere in there saying that, well, I'm paraphrasing, down with the people who do no work. That we're the ones that do the work and they're the ones that get all the profit. And that's not very fair. But putting aside the moral arguments about fairness and also the fact that there are free riders under capitalism, yes, it's a fair worry. If we switch to a socialist society, would you have layabouts who hang on to the work of the rest of us? And I think the answer to that is no, because we're naturally creative, because we naturally like to work, we like to do things. If people try to escape work under capitalism, I can hardly blame them, because it's a horrible system to be forced to work under, where you're doing all this productive work and you never see really much reward for it. But if you give people the opportunity to contribute fairly to society, then I think people would take up on that. And
I feel like it kind of does it a little bit of a disservice, though, because at the end of the day, unfortunately, people are people. We are, animals by instinct. You have unfortunate things like people who commit crimes, and not crimes out of necessity either, where it's robbery due to poverty to sustain yourself. There's people that rape, there's people that murder, there's people that are bigots and racists out there. So I feel like that's almost contradictory to human nature to expect somebody not to try and game the system. So to say that we know for sure there would be no free rides, I think does a bit of a disservice and a gloss over of the theology.
Well, personally, I disagree. I don't think that human nature is fundamentally bad or lazy or greedy. I think there will always be some people like that, but human nature really is relative. We're a very adaptable species, and what is human nature today is totally, totally different from what it was 1,000 years ago. And that is totally, totally different to what it was 10,000 years ago, or 100,000 years ago, or however far back you want to go. Is as living, breathing creatures, just like every other living, breathing creature, we have evolved. Um, and it's very difficult to pin down this idea of there being a single fundamental human nature that you can rely on, because we change and we adapt to the system we're living in. And I think a lot of the social problems that exist under capitalism are because people are trapped in this fundamentally exploitative, authoritarian, hierarchical world system from which there is no escape. Um, I think, look at the mental health crisis, which has been remarked on by many people. In the modern day, we have suicides, we have mental health problems that are becoming more and more talked about every day. Um, and I think a lot of these social problems are people lashing out with no real rhyme or reason at a world that is fundamentally unjust. And I'm not going to say that there would be no crime under a socialist system, because obviously it's not true. You will always have some people like that. But we have to ask ourselves how much of the crime that goes on now, how much of the prejudices that go on now are a product of people grasping in the dark for answers and for some kind of satisfaction in a world where our fundamental human satisfaction that comes from being free, from having autonomy over your own life, is being denied. If you don't have autonomy, if you don't have the right to make decisions about your own life, maybe you go and take it out on someone else, on your neighbor, on the person living down the street or whatever. That is a response, a bad response, but a response to the way we've organized our society. And yes, you will have some people who are fundamentally like that. That would be the same under any system. But there is no logical or rational reason to suppose that it would be more of a problem under socialism than it is under capitalism. I think the logic of the argument suggests that these things would all be, the hangers on, the criminals, these things would be less of a problem under socialism, because you're removing the intense pressure that exists on individuals under capitalism for obedience and conformity. And you're giving people a chance to develop natural, healthy human relationships with each other. I think it would lead to a more freer and a more healthier form of human interaction than exists currently, with all the economic constraints that are placed on individuals by the necessity to work or starve. So yeah, free riders, possibly some of them, but there's no reason to suggest it would be more of a problem than it is now. I think, so just going through the argument logically.
Even if there was just one or half the people, obviously that's a exaggeration in both directions, just one guy or, half the people in a whole, there would be no concrete way of dealing with that, because hopefully it just doesn't occur.
Well, it's not that there's no concrete way of dealing with it. I mean, socialists, we don't have a rigid blueprint for what the future should look like.
Would they just be allowed to do that, I guess is what I'm asking? Would there be any repercussions, be it social or something else, for doing that? Or, in this quote unquote utopian society where we're striving for the best possible outcome for everyone, that would be tolerated?
I'll say two things in response to that. I think firstly, like I say, there is no rigid blueprint. If we had a rigid blueprint, then we'd just be despots. But the point of socialism is that the community should come together and make decisions democratically. And I think there'll be nothing to stop people as a collective from putting in place some kind of a set of rules to prevent that happening. What those rules would consist of, I cannot say without being overly prescriptive, because essentially we're talking about the creation of a new democratic society. It would have to be up to the individuals living in that society to decide how to deal with the small problem of hangers on. I can't give the answers. But the question is, do we think humanity as a whole is capable of overcoming this problem? And I do, and I think all socialists do have faith in the human species to come up with the solutions to these types of problems when we are living in a free world, when we're living in a free democratic world. I see no reason why we can't devise the right formula to deal with these sorts of problems, which really I think would only represent a small minority of people. But also, you have to remember socialism can only come into being when it is accepted by a majority of people. It's not something that can be imposed by force or violence. They tried that in Russia and it was a total failure. I don't think Russia represented what socialism is about, but even if we are going to be charitable to them and say it was some kind of socialism, it's certainly not the kind that I am advocating for. That's not the world we're trying to create, not a world based on authoritarianism and force. But what this means is you have to have a majority of people who want to live in that world, and that means that people accept that we do have duties to each other and that we are going to volunteer, if you will, to be a part of this system where we cooperate. I think you can't underestimate the capacity of human beings to cooperate with each other and find the solutions to these problems. And when you remove the when you remove the constraints of capitalism, which is in the coercion of property and the social problems that are caused by it, the mental health disorders, the criminal conduct, which is not completely a result of capitalism, but will at least to some extent be a problem of capitalism. When you get rid of these things, I think we will find an even greater capacity in human beings to solve the types of problems that you're talking about. Why would we suppose that there's no solution that could be had to these problems in the future?
And then if the system was put in place, what would the governing of it look like? Because obviously in a system where people are left to their own devices to do what they want to do because their basic needs are being met, there still would, I imagine, be some kind of hierarchy or government to make sure that the basic needs are being produced in enough of a manner to meet the needs of the people for things like food and shelter. And then that would obviously require a very centralized position of power, I would imagine, to make sure those things are done. So by default, then what are the checks and balances to make sure you don't end up in a situation that skews more towards just authoritative versus, that homogenous society where everyone's having their needs met. You don't let absolute power corrupt anyone.
Good question. Again, there's various different ways of looking at it. So I can answer only for myself, and other socialists will have other ideas. But I think that well, if you go back and if you go and read Karl Marx and people like that, and Friedrich Engels, Engels, I believe, wrote a book on the historical origins of the state. But if you go and read what they say that creating a socialist system entails abolishing the state. Now, that is a very radical headline, but I think it's a less controversial idea when you break it down. They were writing at a time when a majority of the world's states were outright dictatorships, very repressive dictatorships in the Victorian period. No nation, including the UK or the US, had universal suffrage at that time. And essentially every government had some kind of authoritarian architecture. But when socialists say we want to abolish the state, what that means is to replace it with a democratic system that is not based on hierarchies of man over man. I mean, again, I can't give you an exact, a constitutional formula for it because it has to be up to the people who live in this world to choose how to govern it. But, I think something a lot of socialists talk about is you have assemblies elected on the basis of delegates who can be recalled by their constituents at any time if they try to usurp power. So there would be checks and balances at such a system, but there's no need for centralization whatsoever. It's not about the state dominating everybody. Again, they tried it that way in Russia. There were perhaps specific historical reasons why Russia turned out the way it did, but looking back on it, we can say the Soviet model of political control just did not work. And that's not what socialism is about, if it ever was. Karl Marx was certainly not an authoritarian himself. He was arguing in favor of democracy and saying that the majority of people should have control over how their government functions, that people should come together to make the rules in a democratic manner. So I don't think it's about centralization at all. It's on the basis of having an elected form of government that operates on the basis of total accountability of those running the government to those who have to comply with the rules they make. That's the only way you can get outcomes that are fair, just, and equitable, is if you have a democratic society. No society, no liberal constitution in the world really has a system where the government is accountable to the people, not even in liberal democracies like the US or UK. They're there under their own right. Congressmen, members of parliament, presidents, and prime ministers do not serve at the will of the people. They are elected to a term of office, and then their will is unconstrained throughout that term of office. They can do whatever they like, and for the most part, they represent corporate interests instead of the views and interests of ordinary people. They do not protect the rights of ordinary people, whereas if you had a system where political leaders could actually be held accountable to the public and could be recalled, then I think that would be a much more democratic and fairer system, and that's what socialists argue in favor of.
That all makes sense with the checks and balances built into the system. Very direct democracy-esque. It kind of seems like.
Yeah, and also much more localism, having power made in the communities, having decisions about communities made by those communities themselves, instead of, having all the power in Washington or London, give people the right to make decisions about their own communities. I mean, the whole idea of capitalist constitutionalism, and I've actually studied this as part of my law degree that I'm doing at the moment, the Master's in Law. Part of the capitalist ideology is it splits society into the state and the citizen, the public and private. But really the whole thing is a misnomer, is because we have constitutions that are meant to limit what politicians can do, and yet we're perfectly fine with private corporations abusing their power over individuals in the private sphere. And the socialists aren't saying that we should give politicians absolute control. We're simply saying, maybe neither the state nor the corporations should be able to control our lives. Maybe we should be able to control them our own, both as individuals and collectively within a democratic sphere in both the economy and politics. It should be people who make decisions, not unaccountable governments or corporations.
Now, ideally, if you were to implement this, you would have, all 7-8 billion people in the world on board. You'd all make the change in one go, right? Or, begin the transition to make it a smooth process. So you're not just pulling the rug out, right? But obviously that's not very realistic. So how do you go about implementing something like this, which to me would only make sense? You would see a decline in economic output and influence on a global scale, just due to the nature of the system, while still maintaining bad actors and rogue states like North Korea, China, Russia, Iran, the Saudis. How do you prevent them from almost other people implementing this as them having an opportunity to further their own bad actor agendas on the world stage?
Yeah, fair comment. I mean, this very highly depends on what kind of quote unquote socialist you are. I mean, if you look at someone like Lenin, he believed that, I mean, obviously he was very specific to the context in Russia at the time he was alive. His view was that you seize political power. And the funny thing is, if you look at it in 1917, 1918, Europe was sort of a tinderbox of revolutionary activity. Lenin seized power in Russia and was fully expecting the rest of Europe to follow very, very shortly afterwards. And there was an attempted revolution in Germany, which failed, much to everybody's surprise. And the Russians, the Soviets, were left isolated. And I think in some ways their authoritarianism was a very poor response to the isolation they faced internationally, was that they were expecting the end of the First World War to be the beginning of socialism worldwide, and then they were stuck in one country. And the thing about socialism, it's kind of an all or nothing deal. You can't really do it very well in one country because that country is still having to operate within the capitalist global economy. That's why Russia collapsed, the Soviet Union collapsed, because they could not keep up with a world where the majority of countries were capitalist. And in China, they got round it by essentially adopting an entirely capitalist economy, which they more or less have today. It's a very, very market-based economy, and they've seen enormous capitalist Western-style economic growth as a result of that. But they have had to essentially just go along with the world economy. So, the sort of Leninist view of politics failed. You can't create socialism in one country. But then you have the Social Democrats, on the other hand, who thought, well, we can implement socialism a little bit at a time, one reform after the next, gradually leading to a socialist paradise. But they also failed. They also failed because, well, what we discovered was you can't betray the laws of capitalism, and it happened. And there was this economic backlash in the 70s, 80s, where we all went back to being total free marketers because the welfare states they created were not sustainable. And so for my own part, I would say both of these ways of doing it gradually have failed. Really, socialism is something that is all or nothing. It is only going to happen successfully when a majority of the world's population in a majority of the world's countries support it happening. That's the only way it's going to happen. And yeah, you can say it's a long way off, but that may be so. But I think the question we have to ask ourselves as individuals is, do I support that system? am I willing to go out and try to convince other people to support that system? Every person you get on board is one step closer. But really, you can't do it until it genuinely represents what a majority of people support. You can't force it on the world. It has to come democratically or not at all, really.
No, that was really very well put. Do you have any closing remarks on the topic in general for us? Anything you want to go back and retouch on that you thought maybe we kind of glossed over out after the last 2.5 hours? I know there was quite a bit that we talked about.
Yeah, I think I've said more or less everything I can say about it. I will say, I'm not asking for anyone to agree with me. I'm not asking for anybody's support. Really, the most revolutionary act you can do as an individual is go away from this, if you're listening, and think about the questions I've raised and look into it for yourself and decide if I'm being a cynic or if there's any truth to what I'm saying at all. I think a lot of people under capitalism, they might not be socialists, but I think for a lot of people, some of it at least will ring true. And really, it's up to you as a listener, as an individual, to think about the world, to examine it critically, to ask, what are the problems we face as a society? And is capitalism really, really fundamentally, when you get down to the nuts and bolts, is capitalism the best way of solving the issues? Or do you, as an individual, think that we can do better as a species, that we can live in a better world? And if so, how do we bring that world about? I will say, just finally, I'm not here, as I say, to tout any political party or any, I'm not asking for support as such. But if you want to know more, I would recommend going and looking at the website of the World Socialist Movement. In particular, you can look at the website of the Socialist Party of Great Britain, the SPGB, or their sister party in America, which is the World Socialist Party USA, WSP USA. And they have a lot of great resources explaining their ideas, explaining what socialism is, how it would work, and why they believe that it is feasible that we could make this system work. So go away. If you want to look into it more, have a look at their website and have a think about it and come to your own conclusions. And also, it's been a real pleasure talking to you about this. I've enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for coming on. I know it's getting late over where you're at right now, so I really appreciate you taking the last 2.5, 3 hours to come on, talk to us, and really give a nuanced opinion on some of those questions that I had.
It's been an absolute pleasure, like I say, and it's good to have the debate. I think, whatever the outcome is, the more we talk about these issues, the better. And, hopefully one day the world will be a better place.
Yeah, for sure. If you don't have an open dialogue, then whatever the best path forward is can't be shared amongst everyone, because at that point, whether you intend to or not, you're kind of gatekeeping the information that you yourself, whatever side you fall on, believes to be the best path forward.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much, and do send me a link when the episode is out.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you again for coming on. This has been the latest episode of Pondering Pennies.